So let's talk about Cyberpunk. Now, I don't mean specifically Cyberpunk 2077, I mean the genre of Cyberpunk. Because the genre is terrible. Okay, that's a little unfair. It's not that the genre is terrible, it's that the people who still cling onto it make the genre terrible. Cyberpunk is to today what the 60s idea of futuristic technology was to the era where cyberpunk was relevant. It's all based on ideas and politics and notions which are very of the time and which don't translate well. Cyberpunk was relevant in the 80s, and it's been 40 years now, and almost nothing has changed in the cyberpunk genre to account for all the things that they got wrong. Now, it's not a problem to get things wrong. In fact, looking to the future, normally people get things wrong. It's just when you deal with fiction, you kind of have to update it as you go along. You know, the way Star Trek updated things as they went along. Cyberpunk didn't really do that. It's still stuck in the past in the 80s and using notions and ideas which are relevant then, but really aren't relevant now and aren't relevant to looking towards the future. But to understand it, you really need to understand where cyberpunk is getting its ideas from and the things that it's reacting to. Primarily the politics of Reaganism and Thatcherism, as well as the changing technological landscape. In the cyberpunk world, governments are stepping back. They are weak compared to megacorporations, which are international and usually wield as much power and authority as governments, if not more so. Politics are just an extension of boardroom meetings, and most of the world is made up of either haves or have-nots. Again, much of this is responding to the right-wing reactionaryism of the late 80s. It was the world where Thatcherism and Reaganism were ascendant, where right-wing politics were the norm, where governments cut the safety net and basically let corporations do whatever they wanted. That's the world that Cyberpunk is talking about and reacting to, but it's not a world that we live in 2021. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't some things that they got right, but for the most part, it's reacting to a world where the Cold War had either just ended or was just about to end. And so their view of the world is very 1980s. It's a view of the early 90s when clearly capitalism is going to take over the world, governments are going to retreat, business is going to take over, and the world is going to turn into a post-capitalist society where everything is awful. And while you can't say that life in 2021 is awful, it isn't the case that governments have retreated. In fact, in the 30 years since the end of the Cold War, governments have become more powerful than ever. Just look at how companies like Nike or the NBA or Disney bend over backwards to accommodate a country like communist China, a country that uses surveillance technology to control every aspect of their citizens' lives. But companies want access to the market, and they can only get access to the market if they play ball with the Chinese government. The cyberpunk world fundamentally doesn't think this is the case. In fact, the cyberpunk world would argue that corporations would be so strong that governments would want access to the corporations, not vice versa. But the cyberpunk world fundamentally doesn't imagine a lot of things that would be ubiquitous in our life. For example, GPS tracking or copyright protection. Because the cyberpunk world is fundamentally one where modifications to your body are not just normal, but they're almost required. But the thing is that because no one can afford medical care, they go to Ripper docs. But the thing is, though, is that concept of going to somebody who is on the street, who can modify your technology, doesn't really take into account the world that we actually live in. Think about just how hard it is to get repairs on an iPhone. How you have to have a proprietary person work on it, and that jailbreaking it is increasingly made hard, and attempts to do it will brick the phone to the point where you can't get it replaced. Is it really logical to say that, oh yeah, in the future, when you have robot arms, that you're going to go to a dude in a sketchy back alley and he's going to fix you up and give you modifications? Or is it more likely that the corporation is going to put proprietary software on there, ensuring that you can only use it with other proprietary software and only get it repaired from that company? The other thing about cyberpunk is that it fundamentally doesn't grasp the value and worth of the worker. It's responding to a very early 90s idea of what a worker is and what they do. The workforce of the future with automation and everything else, is more highly educated, and that doesn't really mesh with cyberpunk as a genre. Cyberpunk spends a whole lot of time referencing the fact that people are no longer capable of interfering with things, that only a select few are capable of running machines and technology, and that the vast majority of people are essentially homeless bums addicted to various substances given to them by corporations. But this doesn't really mesh with the way that the world actually works. Most of this is responding to a very old and outdated idea of what education is and is meant for. Public education as a thing was spearheaded by, well, industrialists, because the idea is that you could train people in schools, and then you didn't need to spend a whole lot of money training them yourself. And more than that, an educated workforce means that the individual value of education goes down. Basically, labor is a commodity, and the more people who are educated, the less you have to pay individuals, because they're all competing to do the same jobs. So the cyberpunk idea that everyone's just going to be homeless and not have jobs doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because it really doesn't grasp the way that automation kind of has reshaped the idea of the future. It's not enough to have robots. You need people that are going to repair them and make the machines that are going to do the repairs. You need people who are going to maintain all of these machines. The idea is that you need educated people, not that you need more not educated people. In fact, one of the strangest things about cyberpunk is that it almost doesn't take into account the internet and the way that the internet has changed everything. Everything now is connected to the internet. Your fridge, your phone, your car, everything is connected now. There's no such thing as being off the grid. In fact, being off the grid is almost nearly impossible because of the way that AIs and corporations construct models to find you through all the other people who you probably connect with. But what I'm getting at isn't so much that the internet is used for tracking people, which is very cyberpunk. The idea is that so many people have access to so much knowledge now that there are lots of people who are almost too educated, which is why you see a whole lot of people buying into conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories prey on people who are smart enough to understand the very odd logic and confusing and often conflicting messages while they search for a pattern. It preys on people who are smart but seeking meaning, which is not the way that the cyberpunk world sees individuals. The cyberpunk world sees individuals as being barely able to survive and often only focused on day-to-day living, which is not the case of the world we live in. Yeah, many of the reasons that cyberpunk doesn't hold up is true for the same reason things like Watchmen don't hold up, and true for the same reason that lots of various fiction that came out of it and ideas don't hold up. Things like The Punisher and characters like that were formed in the 80s, and it's the very 80s idea of everything from policing to healthcare to the way the government is structured don't apply anymore almost 40 years later. But there's another way in which the cyberpunk world doesn't really resemble reality, and it's due to things that the cyberpunk world couldn't have known were going to happen, and that's post 9/11 discussions about things like national security. In fact, if there's a single giant reason that cyberpunk no longer resembles the real world, it's that post 9/11, the concept of what a government should do, the concept of what a government can do, was radically expanded beyond anything that was thought of in the 1980s. Sure, the concept of things like, the government having a massive military and hyper-jingoism were there, but for the most part, the concept of the nation state being the core aspect of most of the world wasn't there. Again, in the 1980s, the idea that corporations would somehow bend the knee to government or willingly do what the government wanted just wasn't really there and wasn't really formulated. The idea that after 9/11 occurred, corporations suddenly decided to just give up all their data to the government just didn't exist. There's also the matter that cyberpunk couldn't have predicted the rise in religious extremism, and that's not just Islamic extremism in the Middle East. There's also Hindu nationalism in India. There's things like the Buddhist extremism in Myanmar. There's things like Christian nationalism in the West. There's a whole lot of reactionary politics which the cyberpunk world doesn't really imagine as possible. In fact, when religion is brought up in cyberpunk at all, they tend to imagine a sort of transcendentalist way of seeing the world where the people who are engaging in cult-like behavior are usually doing it either because they worship machines or because they're Luddites against machines. But the concept of there still being religion, that religion is such a powerful force in the world, doesn't really exist in the mind of cyberpunk, because cyberpunk envisions a world where technology has kind of quote-unquote removed all of the old quote-unquote mysticisms of the world and replaced them with a new, more scientific, I guess, idea of seeing the world. But this is exactly backwards. In fact, one of the effects of having everything connected, one of the effects of the internet, is allowing radical religious doctrines to spread ever quicker to ever more people through their smartphones. Now, you don't need to be there in person to see somebody, to listen to a sermon. You can get it anywhere. You can get it on your phone, in your car. You can get it in your home. There's nothing stopping you from getting access to things that would radicalize you and ideas like religion. The world hasn't become more rational because human beings aren't rational. It's simply changed to take technology and incorporate it into our own irrationalities. This is kind of what I get at when I say that cyberpunk is to us what the 60s were to cyberpunk. When you look back at the 60s and the goofy ideas they had about what the future was, that was their best approximate based on the ideas that they had. It was a universalist idea, having just come out of the Second World War. So things like the Jetsons, for example, or early Star Trek, the ideas of what human space exploration were going to look like are very of the time and are rooted in the political ideas of the day. Cyberpunk is the same way. It's just rooted in the 80s. And again, 40 years from now, we're going to be looking at, 2020 the same way, because that's how looking into the future looks. No one gets everything correct. But what's interesting is that cyberpunk, for reasons that don't entirely make sense, is still clung to as this idea of the future. In fact, it's almost the base for when discussing what you might call late-stage capitalism, post-apocalyptic futures. Like, anytime anyone describes a dystopia, what they're usually describing is cyberpunk. They're describing a world where cities are horribly burned out and there's a secret above class that lives in gilded mansions where all their robot servants do everything and common people live in the gutters and do nothing. It basically imagines the world as half or 75% of the world is basically inner city slums with the same crime rates that were in the 80s, and the remaining 25% is roughly just the Hamptons. And that's not the world we live in. In fact, now we live in a world where murder rates have fallen by half. The crime wave no longer exists. The war on drugs was a failure, not a success, and for the most part, people are coming around to the idea of making more things legal, not fewer things. And none of this has even touched on the revolutions in things like gender and sex, things which, again, in the 1980s weren't really formulated. I mean, yeah, there were still trans people and gay people and bi people and all of everybody on the gender spectrum, I guess you could say, back in the 80s, but it wasn't widespread accepted the way it is now. In the 80s, no one could even imagine that gay marriage would be legalized within 30 years. It was still the age of the moral majority. It was still the age before Bill Clinton got impeached. It was still the age before anyone could even imagine that, in 40 years, we're going to be having a real debate over what constitutes a man and a woman. And yeah, Cyberpunk touches on a few of these ideas with things like transcending the human form, but it's always talking about them in cases of machines. There's no real conversation about what actually constitutes a man or a woman. It's all about what it means to be human, which is not the same conversation. I mean, even in the past 14, 12 years or so, with gay marriage becoming legal, we've had a huge change in how we see the world. We've had a huge change in how we view each other. And even having discussed all this, we still haven't even discussed the concept of the pandemic, the COVID-19, and how that changes our perceptions of the world, how it changes how we do things and what we see as the world. And we still haven't even discussed how the concept of the modern pandemic is going to change the future. For example, we are now living through COVID-19, and it's probably only going to be the first of many diseases that are going to move through the populations of the world. Remember, in the 1980s, most diseases that people thought of were being eliminated. Things like smallpox and measles and things like polio were being destroyed by widespread vaccination. It's the same problem that the zombie genre has, where the people who are writing this assume that human beings are ultimately moral creatures. The idea that people would intentionally decide not to vaccinate themselves for any number of reasons doesn't really occur to the people who are writing Cyberpunk. Like, we live in a world now where there's a not small number of people who spend their time thinking about the fact that somehow there are microchips or nanomachines in vaccines, and that somehow trying to stop you from getting a disease will somehow, some way, make you programmed into a robot or something. It's not very clear, but again, that's not a world that Cyberpunk envisions. Cyberpunk envisions a world where logic and reason have stripped away a lot of human traits, and that simply just isn't the world we live in. I should also probably point out at this point that Cyberpunk doesn't really handle racism all that well, by which I mean that it doesn't really formulate that racism is a thing. Now, that's not the case across the board, but the primary struggle in Cyberpunk is classist. It primarily sees the world in terms of haves and have-nots, rich and poor. It doesn't really formulate a world in which various groups of poor or even middle-class people fight amongst themselves due to racist ideas. Or what I should mean is that one group of people is racist against another group of people, and that this basically causes them to avoid getting what they want or what they need. Again, Cyberpunk sees the world very much in pro and con, black and white. It sees the world in there is good and there is bad. It's almost very cut and dry. It's a lot of analogies, but my point is that it only really it divides everything into two groups. And the problem with Cyberpunk is that doesn't really look like the world that we live in. I mean, it is the way that the 1980s saw the world, where things are either good or bad. That's the concept behind their ideas about policing. For example, that's where the Dirty Harry kind of concept comes from. Or the Death Wish movies, where the cop is good, but the system is bad, so he has to do the thing against the bad people because he is good. That's the whole concept that Cyberpunk is still clinging to. Corporations are bad, people are good. People that aren't part of the corporations are good, but the corporations themselves are bad, and so no good can come from the corporations because they're bad. The best way to put it might be that it infantilizes everything, where it turns everything into essentially an after-school special. That's not to say that it doesn't have deep ideas to think about how our relationship with technology is, because it does. But on the human level, it doesn't really have that much to say because it can't really formulate the changes that are coming in the future. And that's not its fault, but it is a problem when you're doing that today. Again, Cyberpunk brought up and came up with a lot of good ideas about how we rely on technology, how dependent we are on technology, who controls the technology, and who gets access to things. But on the question of human interactions, on the questions of how we interact with the world, it's fundamentally outdated. Which is why it's so weird that it's still around. This is one of those problems where so much of the world is still clinging to the 1980s. So much of this world and our ideas about popular culture and politics are stuck in a time capsule. It's like the 1980s are still here. Everything from how we interact with policing, to characters, to the way we tell stories, the way we interact with politics is all very 1980s, but the world around us doesn't look anything like the 1980s did. Much of this can come down to nostalgia, I think. A lot of people who really liked Cyberpunk in the old days haven't really moved on with the fact that they've sort of aged out of the target demo. Like, so many problems in our world are from people who don't want to accept that the world has passed them by, that aging has become less and less of a problem, which is yet another problem with Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk fundamentally sees human beings as expendable, where in reality, the world we live in, human beings are being made to work until their 80s because they can't afford to retire. Human beings have to keep working rather than being made expendable. Cyberpunk basically envisions a world where human beings are an afterthought, where the population is too large and we need to cull people because, simply put, we can't sustain all of them. But that's fundamentally at odds with the world we live in, where countries are not only releasing caps on how many children people can have, but the populations are growing rapidly. Because, again, people need people to do things. At this point, I'm kind of repeating myself. The thing is that, again, Cyberpunk is outdated, and its staying power is mostly due to the fact that we're still clinging on to lots of ideas from the 80s, despite the fact that really time and culture have passed them by. And you can still update ideas. Star Trek, for example, has been updated several times. It's not impossible to update Cyberpunk's aesthetic with more modern ideas. In fact, this is done all the time. But the thing is that when you update Cyberpunk's ideas, it's no longer really Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk is more than just an aesthetic. Cyberpunk is a set of ideas and a way of seeing the world, and that way is kind of gone now. Honestly, I'm kind of hoping in 40 years when we all look back at 2021 and we say to ourselves, you know, technology was weird back then, that we won't still be like clinging on to ideas that we're having today. Like, imagine if in like 40 years from now, we're all sitting around and going, man, the people who couldn't imagine what it was like had TikTok and things like YouTube and couldn't imagine the way the world was going to be. Like, let's hope that's the case and we're not like still clinging on it and writing stories about how people are still using TikTok in 2080. Anyway, that's enough rambling for this time. I was going to bring up Orwell and all the things about how Orwellian doesn't fit anymore either because no one uses it correctly, but that's a video for another time, so I guess we'll talk about that eventually. For now, though, see y'all later.